The afternoon had gone quiet by the time my son-in-law walked through my front door without knocking. That was the thing about Darren Tahu, he never knocked. Not once in the 4 years he'd been married to my daughter Melissa. He'd walk straight in like he owned the place, help himself to whatever was in the fridge, drop onto my couch, and start talking at me before I'd even had a chance to put down what I was doing. I used to let it go. I told myself it meant he was comfortable, that he felt at home. My late wife, Sandra, would have said the same thing. She always looked for the generous interpretation. But Sandra had been gone 3 years by then, and I was 63 years old, living alone in the house we'd built together in Tauranga, and I was tired of being generous with people who mistook my patience for weakness. I was in the kitchen when he came in that afternoon. I remember I was making a cup of tea, standing at the bench with my back to the hallway, and I heard the front door swing open and his boots on the hardwood floor. My daughter wasn't with him. That was the first thing I noticed. Darren almost never came alone. "Graham," he said. Not hello. Not how are you. Just my name. Like he was calling a meeting to order. I turned around slowly. He was standing in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen, arms crossed, wearing that expression he'd been wearing a lot lately, the one that sat somewhere between impatience and contempt. "Darren," I said. "Didn't hear you knock." He ignored that. He pulled out one of my kitchen chairs and sat down without being invited, leaning back like he was settling in for a long conversation. "I need to talk to you about the bach." The bach. Of course. It always came back to the bach. I want to explain what the bach meant, because without that, you won't understand the rest of this story. My parents had bought that property at Whangamatā in 1971. A small beachside place, nothing fancy, 2 bedrooms, a veranda that looked out over the estuary. I'd spent every summer of my childhood there. Sandra and I had taken Melissa there every January from the time she was born until she was old enough to bring her own friends. When my father passed, he left it to me, not to me and my siblings, to me, because I was the one who'd maintained it, repaired it, loved it the way he had. The bach was mine. It had always been mine, and it was the last real thing I had left of the life Sandra and I had built. Darren had been making comments about it for 2 years. At first, they were subtle. Suggestions that we should rent it out over summer to cover the rates. Then questions about what I planned to do with it when I got older. Then less subtle comments about how it was sitting there doing nothing when it could be generating income. I'd shut those conversations down every time, calmly, clearly. The bach was not up for discussion. But Darren didn't take no for an answer. That was the other thing about him. "What about the bach?" I said, and I kept my voice even. He leaned forward, put his elbows on my kitchen table, Sandra's kitchen table, and looked at me the way you look at someone you think is being deliberately difficult. "We need you to transfer it to Melissa's name," he said. "For tax purposes. Her accountant says it makes more sense." I looked at him for a long moment. I set my mug down on the bench. "No," I said. That was when his face changed. I'd seen Darren irritated before. I'd seen him dismissive, impatient, rude. But I hadn't seen this particular look before, this flat, cold hardening behind the eyes. He stood up from the chair slowly, like he wanted me to watch him do it. "Graham," he said, and his voice had dropped. "Don't be stupid about this. It's still family. It's still Melissa's. You'd still be able to use it. It's my property," I said. "I'm not transferring it to anyone. You're being selfish." The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped on the floor. I stared at him, 63 years old, and no one had ever stood in my house and called me selfish. Not like that. Not with that expression on his face. "I think you should leave," I said. He took a step toward me. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened next, because I've turned it over in my mind many times since, and I still find it difficult to say plainly. Darren stepped toward me, and he shoved me. Both hands. flat on my chest, hard enough that I stumbled back against the kitchen bench. My hip caught the corner of the drawer handle, and I felt a sharp bolt of pain down my side. I didn't fall, but I could have. He stepped back immediately. He looked at his own hands, like he was slightly surprised by them. Then he looked at me, not with remorse, not with horror, but with a kind of recalibration, like he was deciding whether what he'd done had achieved anything useful. "Just think about it," he said. Then he walked out. I heard his boots on the floor, the front door, his car in the driveway. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. My hip was aching. The kettle had gone cold. Outside the window, the neighbor's pohutukawa was catching the last of the afternoon light, and I stared at it without really seeing it. Sandra, I thought. What do I do? I didn't cry. I was past the age where I cried easily. What I felt was something quieter and colder than that, a kind of clarity, like fog lifting. I'd been telling myself for 2 years that Darren was just difficult, just ambitious, just someone I needed to manage carefully for Melissa's sake. I'd been making excuses. The excuses were done. I called Melissa that evening. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear the television in the background, which meant Darren was home. "Dad," she said, warmly enough. "Melissa," I said, "your husband came to see me this afternoon." A pause. "I know," she said. "He shoved me." Another pause. Longer. "Dad, he didn't mean. He shoved me in my own kitchen," I said. "I want you to understand what I'm telling you. That is a mine." I could hear her breathing. I could hear the television. I waited. "He's under a lot of pressure," she said finally. "The business hasn't been good. He's stressed, Dad. He didn't mean anything by it." I closed my eyes. She was 34 years old, my daughter. I'd watched her take her first steps on the veranda of the Whangamatā bach. I'd driven 3 hours each way to watch every one of her netball tournaments when she was in intermediate school. I'd sat with her in the hospital car park the night she found out she'd lost her first pregnancy, and I'd held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. I loved her more than I had words for, and she was asking me to let it go. "Okay," I said. "Thank you, Dad. Good night, Melissa." I hung up. I sat in the armchair in the living room, Sandra's armchair, the one she'd always claimed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about what kind of man I wanted to be in the time I had left. I thought about my father. He'd been a quiet man, not given to confrontation, but he'd had a line, and when someone crossed it, he didn't shout or threaten or make a scene. He simply acted. He told me once, "Graham, when someone shows you who they are, believe them, and then decide what to do about it." By the time I went to bed that night, I had decided. I called my solicitor the next morning. Her name was Patricia Ngata, and I'd known her for 15 years. She'd handled Sandra's estate, the property matters, the trust. She was sharp and patient, and she didn't waste words. I told her everything. The conversation about the bach, the shove, my daughter's response. I told her what I wanted to do. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Right. Let's do this properly." We met in her office in town 2 days later. I sat across from her and her associate, and we spent 2 hours going through everything. The bach, my will, the trust structure I'd had in place since Sandra's passing, and something else, something Patricia suggested once I'd told her about the physical incident. "Have you thought about a formal complaint?" she asked. I had thought about it. I'd thought about very little else for 2 days. "Tell me what's involved," I said. She told me. It wasn't a small thing. It meant a police report. It meant statements. It meant that Darren Tahu would have a record of what he'd done, in writing, somewhere that couldn't be unseen. It meant my daughter would know I'd done it. "He's family," I said, not as a reason to stop, but out loud, to hear it. He was also in your home, Patricia said, and he put his hands on you. That doesn't become acceptable because of the relationship. I looked out her office window at the street below. A couple were pushing a pram along the footpath. A kid on a bike. Ordinary afternoon. Write it up, I said. What I didn't tell Darren, and what I didn't tell Melissa, was that I'd already quietly begun restructuring the trust 2 weeks earlier before the shove, back when his comments about the bach had started to feel less like suggestions and more like pressure. Patricia had been helping me update the documents to reflect my actual intentions. The bach was now held under a family trust with me as the sole trustee and a clause that clearly outlined conditions for any future transfer. It was ironclad. It was exactly as Sandra and I had originally intended it to be. The shove had simply moved up the timeline for everything else. I spent the following week going about my normal life. I went to my bowls club on Tuesday morning, same as always. I had coffee with my old mate Terry on Wednesday. I drove down to the garden center on the Friday and bought some winter seedlings for the veg patch. I did not contact Darren. I did not contact Melissa, except to reply to a message she sent about Christmas arrangements with a simple, I wanted to give Darren time to wonder. People like him, people who mistake silence for surrender, they always start to wonder. They replay the confrontation and look for signs that it worked. When the signs don't come, they start to feel uncertain. That uncertainty was something I was counting on. On the Thursday of the second week, I drove over to their place in the late morning. Melissa's car wasn't in the driveway, which I'd expected. She worked Thursdays. I knocked on the door, which was something I always did, because I had manners. Darren opened it. He looked surprised to see me, and then he arranged his face into something that was almost casual. Graham, didn't know you were coming. No, I said. I know. I brought something for you. I held out the envelope. It was a standard white envelope, sealed, with his name written on the front in my handwriting. He looked at it. He looked at me. I could see him running the calculation, the same calculation I'd expected him to run. I was 63 years old. I'd shown up unannounced. I was holding an envelope, and we'd had a disagreement about money and property. He took it from me. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The way someone tries not to look too pleased when they think they've won something. Come in, he said. I'll stay here, I said. Go ahead and open it. Something shifted in his expression. He looked at the envelope again. He slid his thumb under the flap and pulled out the contents. There were 3 documents. The first was a letter from Patricia Ngata's office, outlining the updated trust structure for the Whangamatā property, confirming that the bach was held in trust with conditions that precluded any transfer without the agreement of the trustee, me, and 2 independent witnesses. It was stamped and signed. The second was a copy of a formal statement I had given to the police regarding the incident on the afternoon of the 14th, in which I described in plain language what Darren had done in my kitchen. It noted that the matter was under review. The third was a single page in my own handwriting. Not a letter, exactly. More of a statement of intent. Darren, it read. I am aware that you believed you could pressure me into giving up something that is not yours to take. I am aware that when words didn't work, you decided to try something else. I want you to know that I have documented everything, and that the property you wanted will never pass to you in any form, under any circumstance. I also want you to know that what you did in my kitchen was not something I will pretend didn't happen. I am a man who kept his word to his wife and built a life with his hands, and I will not be pushed around in my own home. Not by you. Not by anyone. What happens next is up to you. But I am done being quiet. I watched him read. He went through the first document slowly. Partway through the second, his jaw tightened. By the time he got to my handwritten page, his face had gone a color I hadn't seen on him before. He stood there on his own front step, holding the papers. And for the first time in 4 years, Darren Tahu had nothing to say. "The police will be in touch," I said. "Patricia's office will be in touch, and I'll be speaking to Melissa this evening." I paused. "You should know I love my daughter. I will always love my daughter. But I am not going to be your plan." I walked back to my car. He didn't follow me. The conversation with Melissa that evening was the hardest thing I'd done in a long time. Harder, in some ways, than the afternoon in the kitchen, because Melissa was my daughter and I didn't want to hurt her, and I knew what I was about to tell her was going to force her to make a choice that no child should have to make about their own parents. She was already on the phone when I called, which meant Darren had called her first. I could tell by the way she answered. "Dad." Her voice was tight, controlled. "What have you done?" "I've protected myself," I said. "You've gone to the police." He put his hands on me. "Melissa, he's my husband, and I'm your father," I said quietly. "I'm your father, and I'm 63 years old, and he pushed me in my own kitchen because I wouldn't give him something that belongs to me. Those two things are both true at the same time." Silence. "He said you provoked him," she said. I thought about that. I let it sit. "If you believe that," I said, "then that's your right. But I think you know your husband better than you're admitting right now. I think you've known for a while." Another silence. "Longer. What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on him," I said, "and on you. I'm not interested in destroying your marriage. I'm not interested in revenge. What I'm interested in is being treated like a person." I paused. "The bach stays mine." That was never on the table. "But the rest of it, what your family looks like from here, that's not my decision." She didn't say anything for a long moment. And then, very quietly, she said, "He's been talking about that property for 2 years, Dad." I told him to stop. He didn't listen to me either. It was a small thing. 5 words buried at the end of a sentence. But I heard them. "And I know," I said. "I know. I didn't sleep well that night. But that was all right. Some nights aren't for sleeping. Some nights are for sitting with what you've done and asking yourself if you'd do it the same way again." I would. The weeks that followed were uncomfortable in the way that honest things sometimes are. Darren hired a lawyer. His lawyer wrote Patricia a letter about the police matter, which Patricia replied to efficiently and without drama. The police process moved at its own slow pace. There were no fireworks, no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations. That wasn't the kind of story this was. What there was instead was Melissa, who called me on a Sunday about 3 weeks after that evening conversation and asked if she could come over for a cup of tea. She arrived alone. She sat at my kitchen table, Sandra's kitchen table, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was a teenager and had done something she was ashamed of. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have said something that first night. When you told me what he did, I should have been different." I looked at my daughter. I thought about the bach at Whangamatā and the summer she was 7 years old when she caught her first fish off the estuary and screamed with delight. I thought about Sandra. I thought about all the years that accumulate between a father and a daughter like sediment on a riverbed, layers and layers of ordinary days. "You're here now," I said. "I'm here now," she said. We drank our tea. We talked, carefully at first and then more easily, about what she'd been carrying, the pressure Darren had been putting on her, the business debts she hadn't known the full extent of, the way she'd been trying to keep the peace by asking everyone else to compromise. She cried once, briefly, and I passed her the box of tissues that had sat on Sandra's bench for 30 years. The formal police matter resulted in Darren receiving a formal warning, not a conviction, but a documented record. He knew it existed. That, combined with Patricia's trust documentation, was enough to make it very clear that the path he'd chosen led nowhere he wanted to go. He never came to my house again without being invited. And in time, he learned to knock, cross brass. The bach is still mine. I went down to Whangamatā in June, opened the place up, turned on the hot water, swept the veranda, sat in the same chair my father used to sit in, and watched the light change on the estuary. It was cold and overcast and quiet and completely, entirely mine. I've thought a lot, in the time since, about what I would say to another man in the same position. Maybe an older man, living alone, who started to feel like the people around him have stopped seeing him as a person and started seeing him as an asset to be managed. Maybe someone who keeps the peace because he loves his family and doesn't want to be the source of trouble. Here's what I'd tell him. Loving your family is not the same as accepting whatever treatment they give you. You can love someone completely and still refuse to be diminished by them. Dignity is not something you owe anyone else. It is something you owe yourself. And when you surrender it slowly, quietly, one small concession at a time, you don't just lose yourself. You teach the people around you that you can be lost. My father left me the bach because he knew I would take care of it. Not because I owned it, but because of what it meant. Property is just timber and earth. What it holds is the thing that matters: the summers, the people, the ordinary days that turn out to be the extraordinary ones. No one gets to take that, not through pressure, not through manipulation, and not by putting their hands on you in your own kitchen. When someone shows you who they are, believe them, and then decide, quietly and without drama, what to do about it. I am 63 years old. I still go to bowls on Tuesdays. I still have coffee with Terry on Wednesdays. And every January, I open the bach at Whangamatā and sit on the veranda and watch the estuary and feel exactly where I am. That is enough. That has always been enough. And it is mine.